Okay, so thank you, Paolo, and welcome everybody to the first panel of the day, which is on digital sovereignty. My name is Elisa Oreglia, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Digital Humanities here at King's College. I have the real pleasure to host five great speakers today who will give us very different perspectives on this broad and very much debated topic, as Paolo just said, digital sovereignty. And so we'll hear about the political economy of digital sovereignty. We'll hear about China, China and its tech companies on the one hand, China and its governance of artificial intelligence on the other. And finally, we also hear about data sovereignty, in particular distributed data sovereignty for democratic collectives. So we'll first hear from all of our panelists, and then we'll have a general Q&A at the end. And so please, in the meanwhile, put questions in the chat for any of the presenters. And with this, I'll leave the floor to the first speaker, who's Roy Cobby Avaria. And Roy is a PhD student at King's College, London, here in the Department of Digital Humanities. And he researches digital agriculture and its distributional effects on value chain and its connection to issues like sustainability, development, and social inclusion. So he's going to talk about understanding the digital state beyond the geopolitics, the political economy of digital sovereignty, and industrial policy. Roy, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Elisa, for that great introduction. So I'll share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. So thanks again for having me here. And I'm actually quite happy to hear from my colleagues on this panel, because what I'm going to discuss today is sort of the wider context of this debate. I research digital agriculture, but alongside it, I'm also very interested in the general transformation of global value chains through digitization. And I'm going to start with a bit of an anecdote, which was actually included in Phenomenal World, which is a new sort of magazine which has a lot of stories on policy paradigm change. And this one was quite interesting as a starting point, and it had to do with the first Cold War and the role of computing during the first Cold War. And what happened within the US administration was an interdepartmental struggle between those who were perhaps more favorable or more acquiescent with technological transfers with what was then the second and the third worlds, and then those who were against them. So in the first group, you had people who were favorable to the actions of corporations like CDC, who were sort of engaging in early global value chain activities in countries like Romania, where they were outsourcing the production of certain secondary materials. But then as the 70s ended, the sort of rise of a more neoconservative ideology that later resulted in a reheating of the Cold War during the Reagan administration saw that these exchanges were equivalent to sharing key technologies and key weapons with the enemy. Of course, corporations like CDC were not doing this out of generosity. They were doing this for two main reasons. First, to reduce costs, and in second place, to, of course, have access to markets that would be close to a North American corporation. And this story sort of leads me to two main ways of understanding digital sovereignty. The one that is pretty popular in the press, and of course it is connected to all the tensions that some of them that Paolo was mentioning at the start, have to do with strategic capabilities, such as the whole debate on strategic autonomy for the European Union. But what I'm going to look at today is the political economy of this digital sovereignty. And to do that, I think we need to understand what the role of the state is in these international commercial networks that we call global value chains. Global value chains is a paradigm within political economy which has been used for about 3 decades. And of course, it refers to this idea that according to UNCTAD, more than 2/3 of all global trade today happens within the supply chains of leading corporations. So leading corporations are basically contracting suppliers in other economies. And of course, this is not just a linear movement. Semi-finished products travel across borders until they reach sort of the finish line. But an often forgotten story is how the state also has played a role in enabling these commercial networks. So it's basically has played these 4 roles, and I can provide literature on this at the end of the presentation. The state has been a facilitator, of course, enabling capital movements in the last 3 decades, making it easier for transnational corporations to establish business. The state has also been a regulator, introducing rules on labor and the environment. The state, of course, is also a producer in these value chains, and this is not just in the Chinese case, where of course it is known that a lot of state-owned companies dominate the league tables of sort of economic power, but also in many global north countries, state-owned economies still play a big role in the economy. And then of course we have the role of the state as a buyer. The state in being involved in procurement, we've seen this very recently with the vaccines, how of course the states have been essential in providing that promise of purchase to enable that production. So this goes to reinforce this very important role of the state in this commercial networks. But something that has happened in the last few decades is, of course, the rising value of what are intangible assets. These intangible assets are not just intellectual property, so formal patents or designs or blueprints, but also trademarks, brands, anything that has to do with, of course, intellectual labor. And it's very interesting how Evans, for example, discussing the early internet in the early 2000s, was sort of positing this opposition between what was then an emerging sort of open source community internet movement as epitomized by Wikipedia, alongside the emergence of sort of a more constrained, private and proprietary internet model embodied by Google and the emerging tech giants. And of course, Evans' argument was that if this latter side triumphed, we were going to see a concentration of economic power for northern corporations. This was sort of implicitly admitted. It's implicitly admitted by policy documents such as the OECD, which speak of the secret behind value acquisition and value sort of profit accumulation in value chains being hard to imitate products. But of course, this hard to imitate production, it implies that the goal for companies is getting rid of competition, right? So they're operating in a global sphere, but the main goal is to avoid entrants from sort of stealing their markets. And of course, this is not just happening through intellectual property law. It is more and more, we're seeing that international agreements, as studied by Danny Roderick, don't just imply the reduction of barriers to trade, but also agreements on the protection of investments, the protection of intellectual property. But there's other forces that also contribute to this concentration of sort of intangible asset power. There's economies of scale and scope. So economies of scale, basically, it is quite easy in some of these markets for the incumbent to sort of persist in their dominating position, because of course, for a firm like Spotify, adding a new artist to their catalog is very easy. But if you sought to compete with Spotify, then you'd have to secure all those agreements. Then you have examples like Google of an economy of scope, where Google, through the G Suite, is basically trying to become the default option in free office tools. And then you have network effects, which can be direct and indirect. For example, in Instagram, you will join a social media network when, of course, you know that your favorite celebrities and your friends are there. That's a direct effect. But then, of course, there's indirect effects through which this rise in the number of users makes the platform more successful. It allows the platform to accumulate more money and therefore become better at what it's doing. So all of this combined, they generate data barriers to entry and a certain path dependency, making it easier for big tech to avoid competition and also, of course, have even political interventions through lobbying in the main capitals. And for Durand and Milberg, this has led to a sort of deepening of what was an existing smile curve in global value chains. So in the 1970s, as you can see there in gray, a normal value chain would have, of course, more added value on its two extremes. So on research and development and design, and then on marketing and after sales, you have higher returns to from investments. But of course, now with this ability to first through digital monopolies, second through IPR laws, third through the differential returns on assets. So the example of the iPhone, for example, how Apple is able to extract more than 90% of the value from the iPhone, even though the iPhone crosses several borders in its production. And then finally, the ability to centralize data, which of course enables firms like Amazon to know about future consumer trends. All of these four forces contribute to intellectual monopolization on the extremes, and then of course an increasing competition in the middle, which is of course normally the economic sort of activities in the global division of labor that are reserved for developing countries. And this can be seen, this centralization of data. This is a study of market capitalization of key technological companies by UNCTAD. We can see its concentration, even though it says America, it's mostly referring to the United States. And on the right, even though it says Asia, it's mostly referring to China, with smaller competitors in Europe, even smaller competitors in Africa, and then elsewhere. So the proposal that I have here with this presentation is to try and understand digital industrial policy as sort of a Polanyian counter movement. So you might know Polanyi, he was a sociologist, but also someone interested in political economy in the early 20th century. But of course, his vision of the Industrial Revolution was one where the rise of certain technologies had a spillover effect in the rest of the economy. So, of course, the development of the railways, for example, led to the standardization of production and of production techniques across the rest of the economy. In a similar way, the generalization of digital technologies across many sectors, as I'm studying, for example, in agriculture, is also leading to, of course, an increase in the intensity of data extraction. Of course, famously, Zuboff has spoken of the behavioral surplus, and of course, also the emergence of certain digital policies. So if we see that initially, and this has been studied by Foster and Asmay, if initially these digital policies of sovereignty were mostly framed under the guise of national security, of course, as the Great Firewall shows, more recently, all of these policies are seen to also play a secondary or even primary economic role in, again, in countries like China, but also in Indonesia, in India, in promoting native digital industries and in preventing competitors from entering the country. So this is sort of the idea that I want to present here, that there's a political economy of digitization that is impacting also, it's impacting states, and it's being impacted by states that goes beyond strategic military concerns. So of course the US and China are engaged in these disputes right now, but they're not just related to the future of their confrontation framed under a second Cold War, but it's also it also has to do with the importance of their firms, their leading firms in global value chains. Of course, the pandemic was a bit of a Sputnik moment for European authorities, as about a year ago they were caught by surprise without the technological capabilities to develop their own track and trace systems. They had to rely on Apple and Google. Of course, it is arguable to what extent this was really the case and whether European authorities could have developed their own tools. And then, of course, developing nations inhabit a whole spectrum of initiatives. And this very good article by Mayer from UNCTAD shows the sort of interconnectedness of this, right? So the emergence of digital sovereignty is not just something that should be seen to happen in this sort of grand strategic confrontation, but something that involves both developed and developing economies, because if really digital divides are seen to have to be tackled, any solution will come from, of course, developing countries being able to develop their own digital industries, but also global north economies being aware of the impact that this rise of intangibles in value chains enabled by the digital revolution is having on value chains. And of course, we've seen some of these moves. The European Union and the US are already taking action through antitrust, but also through other legislation. So this is why we should be thinking of a future research agenda that ponders some of these questions. So what are the different digital industrial policy tools that are favored by different country groups? How can we connect previous existing global value chains and global value chain integration strategies to digitization? This is partly my project in agriculture, for example. What are the global agenda setting organizations like UNCTAD in this case and others proposing in the terrain of digital integration? How all of these divides, how do they connect to the inter-firm differences? What is the role in public policy in preventing them if we accept that, of course, the state plays a role in these value chains? And how are leading digital firms influencing foreign policy as well? So we are able to see which of these conflicts emerge from sort of the geopolitics of digital sovereignty, and which of these have more to do with the economic factors. So thanks a lot. You can find me on these places, and now I'll leave the floor to my colleagues.
Great, thank you very much, Roy. This was a very interesting presentation and also a very good framing for a couple of the presentations that are coming up in the panel. So next up, in fact, we have Blayne, Haggart, and Lianrui, who are going to talk about power and authority in internet governance, building China's tech superpower. So, a very nice follow-up on your general introduction. A quick bio, Blayne Haggart is Associate Professor of Political Science at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. And he's also Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, and a Senior Associate Fellow with the Kate Hamburger Colleague Center for Global Cooperation Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. And his research focuses on the global political economy of data and intellectual property, online platforms, internet governance, and North American economic governance. And his colleague, Lianrui is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Arts, Culture and Media at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And she holds a PhD in Communication and Culture from York University. Her research area are also digital platform, political economy, and internet policy and regulation, with a regional focus on China and Canada. So Blayne, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to be on this panel. I mean, from our first speaker, we can tell we're off to a really good start for today. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the book project that Lianrui's chapter is drawn from, and then turn it over to her. So I'm one of the co-editors of this fine-looking new book, Power and Authority in Internet Governance, Return of the State, ? Along with Natasha Tuzakov and Janard Schulte. The volume itself was inspired by French President Emmanuel Macron's speech at the 2018 Internet Governance Forum in Paris. Being in the room for that speech, it was notable. It was a very good speech, but it was also very notable because he was making a very big deal about how states were going to become more involved in internet governance than they were under existing kind of private dominated multi-stakeholder governance frameworks. And it was a gutsy speech to give to that particular room, and it got us thinking to, well, what would the return of the state actually look like? Is this even a useful way of thinking about these things, since states have always been involved in internet governance in one way or another? So we asked the contributors to the book to reflect on this question of the relationship of the state with internet governance widely defined. And we ended up with chapters that fell into 3 general categories. We have 4 chapters that give us kind of a bird's eye view on the question, highlighting, for example, the state's changing role in ICANN, also with internet governance generally, and as well as a chapter that reconciles the role of private and state actors as a form of meta-governance, and a chapter on the issue of global data governance. We also have 3 chapters focusing on democratic states' role in internet governance, including on disinformation in the EU, varieties of digital capitalism in Latin America, and smart city regulation in Brazil. And finally, here's where we get to Lianrui's contribution. We have 3 chapters focusing on authoritarian states and internet governance, 2 chapters on China and 1 on Russia. And I think all the chapters in the book are important and interesting and useful, but these 3 chapters are particularly useful for Western audiences because of the kind of the still existing prejudice that state involvement in internet governance is kind of a slippery slope towards authoritarianism. So understanding what actually existing Chinese and Russian internet governance is, and noting both the many similarities with Western internet governance as well as its limitations, can, I think, be very useful. So that's our project, and with that, I will turn it over to Lianrui.
Lianrui, I think you're muted.
Right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much, Blayne. And today I'm going to present the chapters that I authored in this edited volume, which is titled Building China's Tech Superpower. And with this, I'm focusing on the role of state and domestic champions and foreign capital. So let me take you back to 2018, where China has announced the cyber superpower strategy. So this is actually a national plan that was announced by Xi Jinping back in 2018. And this represents an expansion on its previous strategy announced in 2012 to become a cyber power. So we're upgrading from a cyber power to a cyber superpower. So this strategy was regarded the internet as the underlying infrastructure to be harnessed to further strengthen the national power and the social governance, and also simultaneously as a sector that would allow for profit accumulation and economic growth. And if we examine the history only a couple decades earlier, we'll find that the similar strategy that focusing on making China a telecommunications superpower in 2014. So although this strategy was much smaller, it's not like the cyber superpower as a national-wide strategy. So this national plans for building a telecommunications superpower was announced back in 2004 by the Ministry of Information Industry Minister, which is named Wang Xudong at the time. And the plan was for China to become a strong telecommunications, and the strategy was designed to expand the scale of China's information and communication technology industry and to build this core competency into a global competitive strategy. So if we look at this history, there is certainly an interest in kind of building on the technology power of China. And within this context, and thinking about the key themes and the question that this edited volume was speaking to, I think the more appropriate question to ask is not whether the state is back, but against this long history about techno-nationalism, it's more proper to ask in what capacity is the state back. So by juxtaposing these 2 segments of history, I first look at the role of financial capital that played in China's tech power building. So here you can see 2 models of how China had financed its tech power ambitions. So on the left-hand side, which is kind of a very simplified version of the China foreign model. And this model helps.
Yeah, Lianrui, sorry, we can't see your presentation. It works fine without it, but if you maybe can describe the slides.
Sure. So the China foreign model was basically allowing the Chinese telecommunication operators to join a joint venture with a foreign company. And this allows, on the one hand, for the national state-owned telecommunication firms to draw on foreign expertise, will also allow profit to funnel through these foreign supporters. And this is because a way also to bypass the national restrictions on foreign ownership into the ICT and telecommunication sectors. And this model was widely used back in early 1990s to finance the growth of state-owned telecommunication firms. And especially with China Unicom, by the end of 1997, this company has raised 72%. Sorry.
Lianrui, sorry if I could try sharing my screen to see if just
sure.
for this slide. Okay, let's see if this
Sure.
works.
Yeah. Sorry about this.
Okay, is that working?
Yeah, it's great. Okay, so
Perfect.
yeah, so the on the left-hand side, this is the China model. So it was a main financial model that used to bypass national restrictions for foreign investment in its ICT and telecommunication sectors. And it was a cheap way to providing financial capital without relinquishing state control to this crucial sector. And on the right-hand side, you have this as an example of the variable interest entities model. And this model was actually pioneered by Jinhang back in early 2000. And what this model does is basically allow the Chinese internet company to access capital in a relatively unfettered way. And because again, here we have a national restrictions for with a cap of 50% of foreign entities in the ICT and internet value-added service sector. And you can see definitely a historical continuity carrying from the telecommunication era to the internet era. So next, can we move on to the national champions? And secondly, if we look at these two episodes of history side by side, we'll notice that there is a significant shift of meaning and also policy that focusing on national champions, which are the dominant market players. So on the left-hand side, we have seen the traditional state-owned and operated entities. And they are part of the national champions policy, which was formed early in 1991 and officially endorsed in 1997 at the 15th Parties Conference, and that which seeks to use China's large economics of scale to develop and promote a handful of large-scale and globally competitive Chinese enterprises. And the ICT sector was the primary focal point of the national champions policy. And similarly, that you will see that the China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom was also some of the earliest publicly listed state-owned enterprise on the stock market. And this also is in a way that approved and supported by the state to access capital it needed for its initial take-up. And on the right-hand side, when you're talking about the national champions these days about the Chinese internet, you mostly are thinking about Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu. And this is a significant change in the landscape in the sense that they are no longer the state-owned and state-operated entities, but they rather have a kind of a rather private start in the initial financing of the model, and still it is not owned by any of the state actors. And with this, we have seen the expansion of the adaptation of the national champions policies. So it's no longer focused strictly by looking at the type of ownership. So basically the Chinese state is more open in welcoming various market participants, regardless of their ownership types, as long as it is Chinese. right? With the BAT company, we have seen this close collaboration with the states and its partake in the cyber diplomacy strategies, and also in partaking in ownership reforms of the state-owned enterprise, as well as some international kind of plans such as Belt and Road initiatives. And lastly, we're moving on to look at the systematic role of state that played in this historical transformations. So we can see that the Chinese state overall has kind of relied or built on this dual track strategy, where on the one hand, it has embarked on the very lack financial regulation or regulatory inaction in this sense to secure a strong home market. And we can see this reflected in the VIE structure and the CCF. So far, there's still debate about the legality of these two forms of financing for its telecommunication and internet sectors. And there's still debate between ministries and also between the lawmaking bodies in China whether this is illegal, right? But because it effectively bypassed the existing law that caps foreign investment in the ICT and internet sectors. By turning a blind eye on this structure, the Chinese state is also kind of encouraging cheap access to capital. And on the other hand, that does not mean that the state is completely sit back. It also enforcing and tightening the grips on the internet governance with the cyber sovereignty principles, especially reiterated again in the cybersecurity law with the data localization principles. And on the other hand, we have seen a flash of new regulations that target new and emerging internet service. So there is more clampdowns and regulation for the VPN services, for example, for online news, for financial news services, and there's more licensing requirement for any of the service and content providers. And lastly, and probably most speaking to the most recent development with China's antitrust and anti-monopoly movement towards platform companies, we can see this converging trend about on the one hand of the very lack market or financial regulation, and the other one on the control of the content. So the party argued that it should guard the disorderly expansion of capital, thereby it justify its interventions to curb the capital expansion and also its social implications for the competitive and monopolistic the competitions. So that is my presentations, and I welcome any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lianrui. This was a great presentation, and you recovered very well from the little technical glitch. We'll leave the Q&A at the end for you and Blayne, if you don't mind. And we'll go on to the next speaker right now. And of course, when we think of digital sovereignty, we think of states, we think of big international company, but there's also civil society. So I think that our third presenter, Jessica Feldman, will talk about these issues. So her talk is about distributed data sovereignty for democratic collectives. And Jessica is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, Media and Culture at the American University of Paris, where she directs the Civic Media Lab. She's also an affiliated researcher at the Stanford University Digital Civil Society Lab. Her research is on emerging communication technologies and their effects on solidarity, practices of democracy and affect. And she's also an artist working in new media and who likes to collaborate on design projects with engineers and computer scientists. Jessica, over to you.
Okay, great. I hope everyone can hear me okay and can see everything okay. I guess you'll let me know if not. Cool, thank you. All right, so I just want to say thank you very much for organizing this and for having me. Thank you, Elisa and Paolo, for putting together such a diverse and interesting panel. So my work is mainly on left social movements and collectives, most of which actually operate outside of or even in conflict with the state. So I think what I'm providing here is a bit of an alternative way to think about sovereignty, or whether or not the role of sovereignty in thinking about democratic practice. So most of the groups that I study often practice direct democracy and have values that we think of when we think about democratic state, values of equality, inclusion, and power distribution. So I'm really interested in studying these collectives and these social movements as testing grounds for other maybe progressive ways of practicing democracy. So what I am looking at here is the kinds of digital tools that they use and actually end up designing because mainline tools are not working for their purposes. And I think what I'm going to talk about today is the concept of data sovereignty. And I want to propose that this is really a question about trust and how to handle this concept of sovereignty when it's truly shared collectively. And what I think and what I will talk about is a new project that I'm beginning right now about rethinking models of security engineering around collective ideas of sovereignty. And I want to warn you that I'm not going to talk about blockchain very much. So I hope that's good news and no one's too disappointed. Okay, so just to give a little background, this is a picture of a 15M assembly in Spain from 2012, going way back in history. And I guess most of us probably remember these movements of the squares, that sort of a rash of social movements starting in 2011 in Tunisia and Egypt and sort of moving north through Europe and across to North America, bringing us things like the Occupy movement, the Gezi Park occupation. And what was interesting about these movements was that most of them attempted to govern using consensus-based direct democracy. And there's been a lot of excitement in media studies about them because they were sort of originally called Twitter revolutions, and a lot of credit was given to Western designed social media for helping to organize these movements. What I'm interested in is what that media wasn't good for and what they ended up needing to design. And the design projects have sort of gone forward and developed in other sort of democratic collectives and groups more recently. So in this case, when we talk about the sovereign is really the demos. There is no elected representatives. So the question to ask is how do we make tools that serves the demos? And I think there's a lot to be said about why this matters more broadly and is important right now. So here we see an image of the French Citizens Convention for the Climate, which met in 2019 and 2020, and this is just one example among many of directly democratic experiments that are happening at the state level or at the municipal level. What happened here was there were 150 French citizens who were randomly selected across all regions of France, all ages, all economic demographic, different jobs. And they were brought in to basically talk about how to implement carbon reduction policies in a way that was good for the people. And they did it all through deliberative democracy. And then they had to go online during COVID. And this question of what digital tools can be used for such purposes really came to the forefront. And I will say that from having studied this a little bit, I don't think Zoom is a great place for deliberative democracy. But I do think that this question of scaling up and working across distances is an important question right now. And it means we need to think about what digital tools we're going to use for this type of participation and governance. I'm proposing sort of 3 layers at which innovations are emerging: connection, infrastructure, access and security, and digital design for decision making and deliberation. And today I'm actually talking about this middle one, access and security, which has developed a lot less from the perspective of a democratic collective, and I think it needs some attention. So through my research, what I found emerging from these social movements and some of the groups that have come out of them and lasted longer were these three types of designs: mesh networks and local networks and alternative types of networks. Ways of thinking about data sovereignty that were more distributed or localized, and deliberation and decision-making algorithms for things like referenda or participatory budgeting and things like that. And if we look kind of generally, the result of this 10 years of ethnographic research and kind of values and design analysis of these tools is this chart. And if we can sort of speak generally about certain political qualities in mainline commercial network design and the way in which they really differ from the kinds of tools that were coming out of these groups. And the ones where we're going to really focus on today are these issues of centralization and thinking about the political subject or the actor as the individual rather than the collective. And these are, I think these are the big places in digital design where these are the big sort of ideologies baked into certain digital designs that really cause problems for directly democratic groups. So if we look at security protocol design without getting into a deep description of the way the design is made, it's very hierarchical. It's basically built off military models. If you study this, as I did for a moment during my PhD, you're really taught to think in terms of threats, and you're trained to work for the military, basically. And so it's a really different idea of hierarchy and user, and it forces certain power dynamics that are very different from what these groups want. And really, the problem arises around passwords. So this has been mentioned and discussed in the work of Anastasia Cavado and also Paulo. And they both bring up this problem that arises in allegedly non-hierarchical groups that there's always a bit of a breakdown around who has the password. So Cavada calls this the password wars, where people will get into fights over who has authorship or access to data or authorship on social media pages and start changing the password on each other. So it sounds very juvenile, but I think it actually points to an important political problem that is being really amplified by the technology. And Garbaudo also talks about the concept of digital vanguards, that in these groups that claim to be horizontal and non-hierarchical, actually the people who end up leading the movement and having power are the people who have authorship over the digital face of the movement. So this is a problem, and it's a problem that can be at least somewhat mitigated with different type of design. And I'm gonna move ahead actually and not get into too much detail here because I want to discuss some alternatives. So to briefly, what some of these groups I study started to do is they started to try to solve this issue of data sovereignty kind of at two levels. One is at the level of the server, so who owns the server, where are they located, and the other is by dealing with issues of encryption and passwords. And this second problem really hasn't been solved. So I'm just going to move quickly past the servers. We could talk about them in the Q&A, but there are kind of three types of solutions. You could have a local server that you kind of keep, physically local to wherever the group is meeting. You can use federated servers, which connect a bunch of local servers without sharing all of the data. And then you can have some kind of trusted centralized server, which is close to the more mainline model that we have now, but is something like Rise Up, or is owned by an organization with similar values that you trust, usually a not-for-profit. I'm just going to move ahead here. So the second place where people try to find ways to handle data sovereignty outside of the state is by, of course, using encrypted tools and finding ways to deal with the password issue. And I think I'll just move ahead. Encrypted tools exist. There are lots of really cool open source, kind of not-for-profit encrypted products that a lot of these groups have started using. They're always a little glitchy, and onboarding is always harder because they're just not as, adoption is not as easy because they're not what people are used to using, and they spend a lot, they don't have as much labor power since they're open source projects and usually kind of not-for-profit projects. They don't have as many workers to spend on making the tools really user-friendly. So this is always an issue, but it's an issue that is getting better. The real thing that hasn't been solved is the problem of the password, and the password is always in the hands of an individual, right? Maybe multiple individuals, but it's a place where power coalesces and bottlenecks. And I think what I'm working on now with some computer scientists and engineers is rethinking ways to distribute power around making new types of passwords. And what I would say is there are kind of two ways to think about solving this problem. One is the blockchain model, which basically eradicates the need for trust. So it distributes verification across many parties, and it's done in an automated fashion so that you don't really need to feel yourself as part of a collective. You just spread it out so much that you don't have to trust anyone. Or what I'm interested in thinking about is how do you start to think about designing for a form of trust that puts this trust within the democratic collective rather than within the individual. And there are some interesting cryptographic models that we're starting to examine and think about implementing or tweaking. And I won't have time to talk through all of them now. But I'll just put a few out there, and then maybe we can speak more in our Q&A. The most interesting, there are lots of things that could be discussed here. Zero trust network architecture basically just means that every device needs to undergo authentication before it rejoins the network. It's a fairly new form of trust, digital trust, but it's not non-hierarchical. Distributed ledger technologies like blockchain are actually not that distributed. So the data sovereignty in this case is not, no one has monopoly over the sovereignty of the data because the data is replicated across each device. But this is actually incredibly costly in terms of computing power and also just in terms of like ecological impact because it requires lots and lots of server space. The veracity of a change in the data is distributed across all of the users, and that's the part that makes it more allegedly democratic. There are some problems, I would say, with the way in which that verification occurs. There are two different models. One is called proof of work and one is called proof of stake. And both of them, one of them allows you to do more verification just based on how much computing power you have. It's an automated mathematical process. And this means that the power coalesces around whoever has the most computing power, which is usually a state or a giant corporation. So it doesn't really get us outside of the democratic problem that we're facing. And then proof of stake, it uses a similar process, but privileges those who own the most stake in the blockchain. So again, this isn't a particularly egalitarian way of dealing with the problem. What I would say is the most interesting thing to think about, I'm going to just move ahead here, is a secret sharing model. And what secret sharing does is it actually takes a password and distributes parts of the password across a lot of different users. And once all parts or a threshold of a number of, a certain threshold of parts is met, and they all come together, then something can be unlocked. So this was actually invented in 1979 and just has not ever been implemented at a level that is usable outside of really industrial or military settings. So it's used for things like setting off an atomic bomb, but it's not used for things like accessing a Facebook page so that you can send messages out about coming to a protest. But I think it's an interesting model, and we're starting to think about ways in which something like this might be implemented for collectives. So this is the work that I'm sort of moving into right now. I'm going to move ahead and just talk about some of the questions that we're dealing with right now in our research. So we're starting this project.
Jessica, it'd be great if you could think of wrapping up a little bit.
Okay, I'm on the last slide.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry. So anyway, our questions right now are around this question of horizontal security. And basically, we're trying to first think about it ethnographically and think about how these collectives or citizens' assemblies experience trust, deal with questions of exclusion and vulnerability and what that might look like if it's mapped onto a digital model. So I'm happy to start discussing this further, and thanks very much for listening. This is my contact info. I'll just turn it back to my next presenter.
Great. So sorry for the rude interruption, Jessica. I think we have a lot of interesting things to discuss, perhaps with all the panelists at the end, and we already have a couple of interesting questions. Let me introduce our last presenter for this panel, Jinhang Zeng, who is going to talk about China's AI politics. So we're going back to the state dimension of digital sovereignty. Jinhang is a professor in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University, and there he holds a chair in China and International Studies. His research lies in the field of politics and international relations with a focus on China, and he's the author of several books and articles on Chinese politics and international relations, and he frequently appears in TV and radio broadcast. Jinhang, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be part of this conference, and thank you very much for having me. I think it's great that my previous panelist has provided very critical information about the topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about China's AI politics, probably with a focus on sovereignty and a little bit on digital governance. And this is today's talk really come from part of my publications in the past few years, which have been following closely on China's AI politics, specifically on how artificial intelligence has now been securitized as a national security matter, and how this is not necessarily about great power politics, but also about domestic political economy of China and how different state actor and non-state actor contest and compete with each other within China. And also I've been writing about how artificial intelligence has been used to strengthen China's authoritarian governance, and also have been focusing on China's solution to global cyber governance, how the China really views about the future cyber governance, etc. So when I'm invited to this panel, I find this is quite relevant, and I'm thinking about which part I should really focus on in this 12 minutes time. I think I'm going to talk a bit about AI, a bit about Chinese view of the internet sovereignty, and lastly, if I have time, I will talk a little bit about digital governance. I think some of the basic information has been provided by the previous panelist, which is quite good. So the key argument I'm trying to make in the book I'm trying to writing at the moment is that China's broad AI practice are part of the Communist Party's broad and incoherent adaptation strategy to governance in the digital era, and AI is part of the digital technology package that the Chinese authoritarian regime has actively employed, not only to improve public service, but also to strengthen its authoritarian governance. So let's focus on the bigger structure. I think the previous speaker has already mentioned that many countries, especially great powers, have big plans for tech, and they're all inspired to be the global tech superpower. And so is their plans for AI superpower as well. In the US, for example, the US government has announced a pensions project to ensure American AI supremacy and launched a series of plans to ensure there is artificial intelligence for American people. And in this context, we are not really surprised that China has a similar pensions plan as well. As you can see from the Chinese President Xi Jinping's words, articulating the development of a new generation of AI is an important strategic handhold for China. And indeed, you can find similar kind of document wording from Europe, from probably most of the major countries in the world, including United Kingdom, for example. And in this context, artificial intelligence has been increasingly linked with national security in China, especially in central government officials' documents. You can find security is a frequent word, has been frequently mentioned, and the AI is being linked with economic security, political security, and military security. And this is relevant to the Chinese view of the digital sovereignty, which has been addressed by some of the previous speakers. So, and this links with how China really view the global cyber governance. And this keyword, internet sovereignty, has been frequently mentioned and promoted by China and has been viewed as a Chinese attempt to contest the global cyber norms. And there is a long historical emphasis indeed on sovereignty in China's communication infrastructure industry. It's quite important to go back to that history before we talk about what's happening at the moment. So if you really go back to the ancient China, probably in Qing Dynasty time, you got the century of humiliation in the Chinese historical narrative, and the industry communication in Qing Dynasty was fully controlled by Britain, Denmark, and Russia until 1899. And China had a railway rights protection movement driven by the rising nationalism. So the matter of sovereignty in communication infrastructure industry is being viewed as a matter of high politics. This is relevant to national strategy, and it has military values. So it's not really about social or economic benefits. And this perception and this history has led to a legacy of contemporary view on sovereignty in communication and infrastructure industry, which had a highly conservative telecom policy with strict control over foreign investment. And building on that, we have seen the internet sovereignty in contemporary China, which mainly driven by a source of regime insecurity and driven by the needs of domestic cyber policies. And this is about the state regulation in domestic Chinese cyberspaces and the state control on free flow of information, which is viewed very critical. So under this policy needs, China promotes the idea, the norm of internet sovereignty with two goals. One is to legitimize its domestic cyber policy at the global stage. Second one is trying to export Chinese norms to the global cyber governance in order to ensure it's moving towards the direction in favor of China. And here I'd like to highlight the Chinese state approach towards sovereignty in cyberspace a little bit different from what we often talk about in the West. And China often focuses on multilateralism against the multi-stakeholderism. And the multi-stakeholderism is what we often talk about, the big internet giant NGO in governance, right? For example, Facebook or Google or all the big tech complaints come into the governance. But when China emphasized on multilateralism in the global cyber governance, it heavily emphasized how the state should have a final say in determining global internet policy, with a view that the big internet giant should be supporting the state goals. So there is a critical difference here. Obviously, the reason for that is in the domestic Chinese political context, the state of the role of state play a very important role in China's socio-economic affairs. And non-state actors, including big giants and NGOs, their role are very limited, and their role was supposed to be there to support the state. So this has led to a kind of Chinese discourse of internet sovereignty, but when it actually become being applied into the practice, and lead to critical problems. Even within China, there is only one broad consensus that this concept is important. China should promote internet sovereignty, but there are huge disagreements over where this internet sovereignty comes from, how to define it, how we can put it into practice. Examples of that, for example, some of the Chinese scholars saying that we should, if we are going to have internet sovereignty, then we should have cyber borders. But how are we going to have it? And some of them argue we probably should have geographical location of cyber infrastructure, but this would undermine China's national interests, because in that sense, most of the cyber territory will belong to the US. It's not something China wants to say. Others argue that we should focus on the quantity of information resources. Some of them argue we should focus on economic skills of national network, or even population of netizens. So the point to emphasize is that even within China, the idea of internet sovereignty is contested, and it's difficult to put that into practice. And this is summarized by one of the Chinese retired officials, for example. In his view, there should be 3 layers of internet borders. One is outside layer, which is about flexible one. It's about the range of a country's national internet sovereignty. In the middle is a geographical border, including cyber infrastructure and domestic public opinion field to fight against invasion of the Western liberal views. But what is the most important is a core circle of the Chinese Communist Party's regime to ensure that this cyber governance is there to support the Chinese Communist Party, to support the current authoritarian regime. Again, this shows about the strong sense of regime insecurity, as I argued at the very beginning. So in this context, we are not really surprised. We are seeing a lot of narrative, the rise of narrative between China and the US, or people talk a lot about a global AI race, right? And in China as well, China is very active in putting forward norms and standards for AI governance. And this leads to a question of the future AI rules should be written by whom, for whose interests, and in whose terms. And clearly what China is trying to do is ensure China have a strategic hold hands in the field of AI and the future AI governance. And we are not really surprised that the rise of AI in China and China's global AI ambitions, really what's behind it is not only about technology per se, it's also about ideological competition. And what really China is promoting is a very different, what is driven China's AI growth is based on very different political values, political and social values. So for example, China is currently leading artificial intelligence facial recognition technology, while those facial recognition technology has been widely applied in China. If you go to the airport or if you do the payments, everywhere, it's being widely used. And if you want to avoid it, it's going to create significant inconvenience. But in comparison, in Europe, for example, European Union considered a blank ban of facial recognition technology in 2019, and the European data regulation has made the European AI companies facing a very difficult competition from the US and China. It's the same in the US as well. The use of facial recognition by police and safety agencies has been officially banned by a group of American cities in light of Black Lives Matters campaign, for example, and some Google CEO mentioned that he is in favor of a temporary ban, etc. So clearly, what we have seen, and also Microsoft, Amazon, and IBM has been limiting the use of their facial recognition technology by American police. So what we have really seen is a different kind of direction of travel in regards to those AI technology driven by a very different policy from China. And so we shouldn't be surprised that China had big ambitions for AI. It can be concluded in 3 parts. The first one is to reach the same level as leading countries by 2020, which was last year, and the second step is to make major breakthroughs in some part of AI technology and developing an AI industry worth of 400 billion yuan by 2025. And the third step is to become a world-leading AI superpower by 2030. And what's behind this idea of AI superpower is clearly how China can use AI to promote and improve digital governance, for example, and in a smart city project, intelligent government project, for example. Because of time, I will not go into too much of the details of it. But the point to make here is AI has been actually quite helpful in maintaining China's public security and has been widely used to fight the crimes. But the problem with that is also the focus of today's conference is the rise of surveillance states and Big Brother, for example. And we know that even in democratic states, we have seen how the AI technology has been used by the state to implement their control. And so we're not really surprised in China. You have seen quite the rise of surveillance states and all the kind of Skynet projects and cameras everywhere. And I think the colleagues also mentioned about individual archival, which is a social credit system. Because of time, I'll just skip it. So just to summarize, I think the point I'm writing at the moment in the new book is I consider there are 4 basically challenges for China's AI ambitions. The first one is how the government is going to make a balance between the privacy and convenience. So far, the public debates in the AI is quite in favor of the state agenda, but we have really seen the negative problems created by AI, especially regarding privacy. How the state is going to deal with it, how the state is going to balance privacy, convenience, security and convenience is a big problem. And the second one is how the state can really make use of AI technology to move towards a digital AI economy in order to boost economic growth of China. That's obviously the most important goal. And along with that, if China is running towards AI economy, what we're going to say is high level of unemployment or human labor is going to be replaced by AI or by automatic robots. Then how the state is going to deal with a high level of unemployment and social insecurity and the public order issue. The last one is about what kind of values the AI stands for. And this is why I'm trying to argue that AI probably stands for communism or AI stands for Marxism. Because of time, I think I'm going to stop here. If you are just interested in some of the points I make here, then you can find you can find from the relevant publications. So thank you very much. I'd like to hand back the floor to the chair.
Great, thank you very much, Jinhang. We do have a couple of very good questions, and I also have a question for some of the panelists. So I think these are questions that are for specific people, but it'd be great to have the input from the whole panel. So from Wessel van Rensburg, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. This is a question for Roy. Roy, Facebook tried to use the argument of sovereignty to defend Libra against regulators, but it did not work. So do you have anything to comment on that? And Roy, let me get a couple of questions in the second question, where I would also like to hear Blayne and Lianrui's take on is this. If the platforms have economies of scale and scope networks effect, and now the compounding economies of scale of machine learning, some argue that they are natural monopolies. So they don't need IP law to protect their positions, or do they? So what are we requiring laws so that they do not take as the largest slice of the economy? Is there not a tension for the US between introducing competition in digital platforms and having national champions that act as digital imperialists and benefit ultimately the US? And so I'd like also to hear Blayne and Lianrui exactly, because Lianrui talked about national champions in China. So this is a question that could apply for to China as well. So Roy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll start. On question one, on the whole sovereignty debate, and it's true that it does seem to be still in the cards for Facebook to go ahead with Libra, but it's true that the argument didn't work. Although I'm quite sympathetic to the body of literature that speaks of corporate sovereignty, which is of course something that is at the heart, it's in the origins of our economic system, of capitalism, with the example of the East India Company, for instance. There's always been an element of corporate power in terms of setting rules, of course, ordering labor, ordering financial flows, etc. And somehow all of this literature on the refeudalization of society through digital firms has enabled us, I think, to go back and look at how actually corporations somehow in our current economic system have always had traits like that. So I think I don't have a direct answer to this, but I think that's the best answer I have to give. That I think that literature on corporate sovereignty is quite good at illuminating some of these factors, and I think I can give recommendations if someone wants more specific recommendations. And on question two, before I let my colleagues answer this as well, this is one of the points that certain people who are a little bit more cynical about this sort of antitrust initiatives in the US and even in the European Union were raising, which is that parts of the US establishment are aware that, and we just saw this with the last presentation, right, that the large scale of these corporations is what is allowing them to compete with the emerging sort of Chinese nexus of giant digital corporations as well. So it is true that there could be a sort of conflict of interest there, although I do see a certain change in the attitude of regulators. So it is true what you're saying, that perhaps IP protection is not that important anymore because of this inherent anti-competitive tendencies. I don't think so. I mean, and I'll give you an example, because what I'm studying right now in the agricultural sector shows how both can operate at the same time. And you don't need to be an expert to know about all of these controversies within agriculture, intellectual property of seed, intellectual property of what is in essence, of course, a natural process, to see how in the future data accumulation can actually sort of multiply its effects and vice versa through intellectual property protection. And this is the kind of struggles that we are seeing right now from the more bottom-up perspective that was also mentioned. So there's a lot of, for instance, peasant movements that are opposing the centralization of agrarian information in private hands. And I'll let my colleagues sort of expand on these questions.
Okay, I guess I can go and then turn it over to Lianrui. Yeah, on the national champions thing, I think the thing to remember, and borrowing a line from Susan Strange, is that markets might be global, but companies are national. So that I wouldn't be too distracted with respect to kind of like the international economic issue of US antitrust moves, because I mean, their interest is also in guaranteeing the success of American companies internationally, and it has been ever thus. And to understand that, we can look, for instance, to the so-called next generation trade agreements, which, like for instance, the recently concluded North American Free Trade Agreement replacement, which basically guarantees free flows of data across borders, and that's the kind of fundamental thing you'd want to see in trying to guarantee the success of your digital and database companies, because of course at a certain size it takes knowledge and it takes data to make data and knowledge, and so the incumbents, this privileges the incumbents. So that's kind of how I see that. And actually, that question is really interesting, because I was actually going to ask Roy a question about to what extent the economies of scale and scope are the result of the regulatory environment rather than just the technology itself. And I think that your case study is, of agriculture is a great way to think about this. But you could also use banking and make a similar argument about scope and scale, namely in that one of the big differences between banking and everything and what we call tech today is that these companies came of age in eras with very different views on the legitimacy of global regulation. So that's kind of an issue. And I'd also add, and maybe we can talk about this later, but about the extent to which you highlight intellectual property, but I wonder if intellectual property is really the key, and the commodification of knowledge is really, and not the digital is the key to what we're looking at, because digitalization kind of describes how these things happen, but the underlying driving force behind a lot of the things that we're all describing here seems to be a particular attitude towards knowledge as something that can and should be commodified. And this is something that predates the commercialization of the internet, and the focus was initially things like pharmaceuticals. So great question and good presentations.
Lianrui, would you like to add something?
Sure. So I'll just add 2 brief points on the platform expansion, IP, and also national champions. So what I think is very interesting in the sense that IP has becoming has a comeback in the age of platform competition in China. So especially, I think they have been. It's not a straight state-driven process, because China has historically have a very weak legal framework for protection IP. But IP has been capitalized or weaponized as a means for enclosure and commodification between platforms. So an example is Tencent Music. So basically, with the Tencent digitize its music offering services, it's basically almost 60% of all the music that existed on the Chinese market. And I think it kind of basically mark the terrain and also kind of divide its basic ownership within that field. So that has becoming a focus for the antitrust regulation in the Chinese sense. And also what so distinguishing about the national champion in the Chinese sense versus the US is that the national champions has not been so successful globally compared to the US ones. Right? So if you, there are all these kind of fancy initiatives and collaborations between states and private companies, but if you actually look at the revenue generations or revenue streams, other than TikTok and other kind of smaller scale platforms, for Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu, they really go over 10% of all the revenue that generated for the Chinese economy. So that's the input from China.
Thank you, Lianrui. I wonder if I can follow up with a quick question that is for you, but also for Jinhang, because Jinhang, Lianrui, when you talked about Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and you talked about their collaboration with the state, and it's a double-edged sword, because it's, of course, it is helpful and it is something that they have to do to stay in business, but it is a problem for their global expansion, because they are identified with the state, even when they would like commercially to pursue other goals. Jinhang, you said that in terms of global cyber governance, the Chinese government has made it clear that the state should have the final say in terms of global governance. And so I wonder if you could both comment briefly on this tension for Chinese champion and big Chinese corporations between having to collaborate with the Chinese state, benefiting from it, but also having it as a big obstacle in their global expansion and ambitions. Jinghan, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think it's clearly in a Chinese context, the big giant working with a government is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, working with the government closely, then you are going to win the clearly state support. That would mean there will be more state resources, financially and policies, which is going to support you. And in AI specifically, the Chinese ministry has created what they call a national champion of AI team with Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and all be part of it. And one of them specialize in a specific AI area to develop with. That's what they call the national champion team of AI. So by doing that, clearly they hold they are highly valued by the government, and that would mean they will get a lot of support from the government. And it's important to know that in the big internet giant, although a lot of them are invested by foreign capitals, they have the party committee. This would mean the Chinese Communist Party committee had people have local branch in the companies, and with a representative there who is going to shape the day-to-day operation of the companies. So that's clearly some institutionalized mechanism for the state to have their influence. But on the other hand, clearly, this might be unhelpful to the Chinese internet giants or probably China's startup companies, because too close relation with the Chinese government now in the context of US-China geopolitical competition, this is increasingly become a problem. Under Trump administration, for example, a few AI startup companies in China has been sanctioned because they have been working with the Chinese government in promoting surveillance in Xinjiang, for example. And we all know that TikTok and Huawei, especially Huawei case, because of Huawei's close tie with the government, is something linked to the sanction from the US as well. So in those, all those points, I think it's really double-edged sword for the Chinese internet giant. I think on the one hand, they're going to win from the domestic market, but this might undermine the global ambitions. But ultimately, I think the state is sending a very clear message that the big internet giants, they should be serving the national agenda. And previously, we see how Alibaba wants to have the world's largest IPO by Jack Ma, and that was basically stopped by the government. That's a clear message that the financial regulation is going to be there, and all those needs to listen to the law, and they should be serving the national agenda. So I think that's very clear direction of travel, and all the big internet giants, they are going to comply with that as well.
Thank you, Jinhang. Lianrui and Blayne, do you have anything? What's your take on this?
Sure, I can go ahead. I think the kind of contradictions that Elisa, you mentioned was perfectly exemplified by TikTok, right? So because TikTok's former body, like before it become merged and become TikTok, was Musical.ly, and Musical.ly was also a Chinese owned and developed kind of a social app, and so I think in that sense, a lot of the Chinese companies, when they wanted to, because if we're talking about the national champions, so there is an emerging line of business that when they first develop their service, they're mostly targeting the foreign company, a foreign market, and they kind of downplay their national identity. So no one has raised the eyebrow on Musical.ly because it is a Chinese-owned music app until it become popular and merge with TikTok and gain such a popularity. I think there is definitely an issue when it's become popular and become attracting more regulatory attentions. And also, I think there's a probably different geographic locations. So if we look at the appealness of Chinese model, probably in the liberal democracies, this seems like very kind of not ideal. But probably for other kind of emerging and developing countries that are not democratic, the Chinese model or the Chinese way may seem very appealing for their national governments. So I think there is definitely a complex issue to deal with on the part of the companies themselves. And also, yeah, so that would be my input.
Thank you very much, Lianrui. Blayne, do you have anything to add, or should we move to the last question?
I'm good, thank you.
Great. So I think we have time for one last question, and it's great that it's for Jessica, so that we go back from the state to civil society activism. And so, Jessica, this is a question again from Wessel van Rensburg, who says, open source has some of the best technical minds working on it. So as we know, most servers run on it, most operating systems are still based on open source code. And code can be written in modular ways, so it's easy to collaborate on. The problem is that the good design, that is user interfaces, seem to favor a single author. And open source has trouble embracing visionary design. So I think this is more of a comment and a question, but it'd be great to hear your take on that, since you've shown some of the very real challenge of design that favors, I would say, not only the single author, but also the individual user.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of the comment. That I think most of the more successful and widely adopted open source projects work at a lower layer of the technology, and as was said, the user interface is very rarely well developed in open source projects, and I don't know. I've attributed that just to like the labor isn't going to that. And a lot of the projects that I've looked at that are really focused on like security, like Jitsi or something like that, they've gotten a lot better over the past year now that everyone has been online for everything, but they're always kind of clunky. And the problem, from what I understand from being part of some of these projects, is that they're just struggling to keep up with the security updates that they need to do and keep it. They don't have time to work on the UX, and it becomes contrary to their values because they end up being a lot less inclusive, because older people who are maybe less digitally native have a harder time using them. People who it ends up sort of falling across the lines of digital exclusion that they probably philosophically disagree with. So it's something to try to put some resources and time into, I think.
Thanks, Jessica. I don't want to push anyone's attention boundaries, but since we still have 3 minutes, I have to ask one last question, because Jinhang, you kind of left us on a cliffhanger, and Zena, Feldman, but also I really want to know, what do you mean about AI being communism / Marxism? That's very intriguing. Can you say something about this in 2 minutes? You're muted, Jinghan.
All right. Okay. Sorry. I think. Sorry about that. So basically, I think there's a lot of discussion in China regarding how the future world is going to look like, and one of the most famous kind of probably reference to make is by Jingdong's boss, CEO. His name is Liu Qiangdong, and in his view, that he believed that in the future, not in the future, in our generation, communism will be achieved. The key reason for that is he believed, following the current technological situation over the past few decades, and he believed that in the future, all the works can be done by robots. And the robots can do all human labor's work, and will be able to create enormous wealth. That the government's job in the future is going to simply distribute those wealth to everybody. So there is no rich people, there is no poor people, because everybody will have enough access to all those kind of material goods. So in his view, that in the future, a human only need to enjoy or do something artistic or philosophical and leave all the work to be done by the robots. And this sounds very familiar, very similar with this kind of AI-enabled utopia society is very similar with Karl Marx's vision in 1840s, in which everyone have free and equal access to the distribution of goods, services, and capitals. And indeed now we have already seen that how the robot has been doing a lot of human work, and in the future, if it's able to produce enough material goods, then this might be something possible. And what the government can do, I mean, in the UK now is providing universal credits. So in the future, probably the government's role is going to move towards of how we can make equal distribution of the resources. So in that regard, Blayne is arguing actually potentially this AI is maybe a Marxist or a communist by doing that. So this is why I mentioned that the book I'm currently writing about is trying to write about potentially how this future scenario or future prediction about the future is making communism not such a negative kind of words now in today's context. When we talk a lot about communism in the context of future technology or in the future world, it's actually making it a good term in many ways. And the other point to make here is previously in Soviet Union that the central planning system or the planned economy, the key problem with that is no human planner is able to predict and react to the market quicker than the market itself. But with the super AI and with the decision-making power that AI gave to the human society, probably in the future we are going to make decisions better than the market itself. So that would mean a kind of new decision-making model we have never seen. This would be probably will be AI-driven kind of planning ahead and market-driven kind of system, which will be different from the current kind of market economy we are going to have. And this actually adapt a lot of values from the USSR's central planning system. So all of that is pointing to a potential kind of scenario to that. But I leave a question mark here because we don't really know. And this is something I'm still working on at the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Jinhang, and thank you to our panelists. Please join me on a virtual applause for a very stimulating panel. We can now, it's 2:45, so we can take a short break and we'll reconvene at 3. But thank you again very much, Roy, Blayne, Lianrui, Jessica, and Jinghan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.